Imperialism, industrialization, and nationalism reached all corners of the world during the late 19th century. These key societal ideas became more common after the Napoleonic era, and after taking hold in Europe and other Western countries, began to become a part of Japanese society. After many years of being a self-sufficient nation, in the late 19th century, Japan began the process of becoming a different kind of country. Japan became more like a Western country. Following in the footsteps of other Western nations like Britain, Germany, and Italy, Japan began to use imperialism, created a great economy and society through industrialization, and brought the country together through nationalism. In the 19th century, imperialism was a dominating force within Western culture, but it wasn't until the late 1800s that it caught on in Japan. Imperialism being the practice of extending a country's power and dominion by expanding their territories or gaining control of other areas. For almost 100 years, the Japanese had been standing back and watching Western civilization evolve, and they saw various countries attacking and gaining land. The other countries now started to look down upon Japan. Due to this, they felt a need to explore the world of imperialism, so they aimed their sights at Korea. They knew that Korea was full of raw materials and farmland, and in addition, they were less powerful than Japan at the time. Sadly for the Japanese, they were not the only country eyeing Korea's resources. China had also started to consider Korea to be an important trading port for them, and this caused heavy tension between the two competing Asian countries. Both Japan and China knew that a battle was unavoidable unless a compromise was made, so they agreed in 1885 that neither would send troops into Korea. 9 years later, the Korean king requested help from Chinese army to diminish the peasant uprising. This act broke the two countries' agreement and angered Japan greatly. They responded by sending their own troops to battle the Chinese army. These events eventually sparked the Sino-Japanese War. The battle lasted for a few months, but the Chinese were eventually driven out. In 1895, a peace treaty was signed that gave Japan total control of several areas within Korea. This was a huge moment for Japan, as they had just won their first colonies, and they had their first taste of imperialism. Japan continued to work towards being one of the world's great powers by becoming an imperial force not to be messed with. They had emerged as the first non-Western nation to show imperialism, and because of this, they proved to be fairly different from the Western nations. One of the big differences was that they were rising out of Western colonization and reforming into their own independent nation. The second difference came from how the Japanese proved to be ruthless and brutal in their imperialistic efforts. They would harshly attack any country who made them somewhat angry. One example is the Sino-Japanese War, where it brutally forced China out of Korea when China was only trying to aid the Korean government. It was not only out of the country that the Japanese government proved to be brutal, but within its borders as well. Young Japanese soldiers were encouraged by their government and parents to come back dead if not with a victory. And to raise the egos of soldiers, they were put into comfort houses where Korean and Japanese women were shipped in and made to have sex with up to 20 or 30 men a day by threat of beatings and/or death. Japanese expansion still kept some ties with the Westerners because it was fueled greatly by social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is when a group of people believe that their race or nationality was evolutionarily more advanced than any other and believed that it is their right to control them and colonize them to make those people just like their own nation. Along with this, the Japanese government developed a new systematic goal for their expansions. They wished to gain security, nationalism, and resources exactly like what the Western countries were fighting for. Despite Japan's hard work, they were still treated like any other Asian country in the world, as the West world would not accept them as another great force. Japan continued to lag behind European nations because of heavy social Darwinist mindsets from those European powers. Japan was slowly expanding and continuing to try and climb up the ladder of greatness. After a surprise victory over China in the Sino-Japanese War, Japan did evolve as a great force between the Asian countries. It was not until World War II when the Americans would thwart them. The early 20th century was when they got to show their powers once again in the Russo-Japanese War. Russia was another great force in Eastern Asia. They were a clear threat to Japan and became an enemy of the nation because of it. After a failed peaceful negotiation, the two countries broke into war over Manchuria. a Chinese country to the north of Korea. Japan launched a surprise attack on Russia's navy in 1905 and effectively diminished it to next to nothing. Not only this, but Japan won numerous land battles to the point where Russia was forced into signing a peace treaty in 1905 that kicked them out of Manchuria, giving power to Japan, and said that they would not touch Korea. In a span of about only 20 years, Japan had tasted power and surpassed many of the leading powers of East Asia. Power had a sweet taste for the Japanese government, and they did not stop after winning over Manchuria. They had wanted Korea for so many years, and after defeating their enemies, they viewed it as a perfect time to finish one more task. Japanese advisors slowly moved into Korea and began to gain power over the next 2 years. By 1907, the Korean king gave up and announced that he would no longer control Korea. Not long after that, the Korean army started to fade away, and by 1910, Japan officially brought the entire country into their control. Continuing their old ways, Japan ruled with a harsh fist and did not make life easy for the Korean people. They disallowed newspapers, completely changed the schools, and took land from Korean farmers for their own people. Japan had no mercy and placed fear into the majority of Asia. Japanese imperialism had been some of the worst instances of the worldwide hobby. They treated any one of their victims terribly and even treated their own people with no respect. This nation was a symbol of terror, maybe one of the most terrifying examples of imperialism seen throughout this time period. Nonetheless, the Western civilizations saw what happened and would still not show the country any respect, and only continued with their own agendas of imperialism, giving a blind eye to what was happening in the Far East. Industrialization is the process by which a society or country transforms itself from a primarily agricultural society into one based on the manufacturing of goods and services. Japan is an excellent example of how industrialization can completely change a country. Before industrialization, Japan was agriculturally productive enough to sustain production in both rural and urban areas of the country, and it did not need to rely on a strong manufacturing economy to keep the country stable. In the mid-19th century, both private and public sectors began investing in domestic Japanese companies. This allowed more products to be produced, which helped with the growing demand for many products. This growth in investments allowed for the government to increase capital accumulation. Japan's economic growth was due to an increase in investment rather than export. Japan used its extra government capital to invest in children's education, which would improve the Japanese social infrastructure in the future. While life for adolescents was getting better, so were the conditions for workers of Japan. This was made possible by the government creating internalized labor markets. Internalized labor markets forced the workers to be bound to their company and their company to be bound to the workers. This gave the workers a strong incentive to adapt to new and developing technologies. These internalized labor markets were directly responsible for improving the social capabilities of Japan. This also made it easier for companies to be able to secure foreign technology and again enhance the societal capabilities of the technology. The creation of internalized labor markets also caused Japan to have more output than input. This caused Japan to shift from a time period of low productivity in agriculture into a high productivity in manufacturing, mining, and construction. Because of the increase in capital, Japanese laborers could be paid relatively high wages. Although Japan greatly expanded its manufacturing industry, it also expanded agriculturally. Because of the rapid increase in enterprises, Japan took away its taxes on agriculture and replaced them with industrial taxes. These increased capital in Japan and also created more agricultural products. Japan also had a land reform where it gave peasants the ability to own the land that they worked, instead of working government land. This boosted production of agricultural goods and created more revenue in agriculture. One major problem that Japan faced through industrialization was that they did not have very many natural resources. This created a problem with the expansion that they wanted to achieve. To fix this problem, Japan would take resources from other Asian countries that surrounded Japan. This problem would not only affect Japan, but other countries surrounding it, which made a greater problem for Japan in the future. Although this could easily be achieved, it would take time and money. With its high capital and successful economy, Japan was able to use the money to develop a modern navy, and to secure a strong central government, Japan developed a strong national army. Both of these things helped Japan defeat China in the Sino-Japanese War. This gave Japan control over the areas that are now North and South Korea. Japan's military was also a great help in the Russo-Japanese War. Fighting these wars also increased nationalism throughout the country of Japan. Relying heavily on ideas created from other Western countries, Japan followed in the footsteps of many other Western civilizations. It became the first nation in Asia to become industrialized. However, unlike many other Western countries, Japan made sure to keep its rich heritage and original customs. Nationalism in Japan was really strengthened in the late 19th century and first half of the 20th century. Nationalism is when someone associates themselves with an ethnic or nationalistic group over their country, and that is what happens in Japan with religion. During this time, Shinto became a recognized state religion, which seriously affected the cause of nationalism. Even though Japan had a late start with industrial modernization and economic growth in comparison to other countries, at the time it made up for it with its military. They proved to have an effective military with victories over China to gain Korea in the Sino-Japanese War and over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. As a result of growing imperialism, the people of Japan saw their country as a real contender in the world, and nationalism was also strengthened. In the beginning of the 19th century, the Japanese government set expansion as a methodical goal. They wanted to expand to increase security, resources for industrialization, have a better market for manufactured goods, deal with the settlement of overpopulation, and gain national pride. These goals were done simultaneously at most times. Japan brought nationalism to their country when they secluded themselves from the Western world, following in the footsteps of China. The only way Japan was still connected to the rest of Europe was the port city of Nagasaki, but besides that one port, they remained isolated until the midpoint of the century. In 1871, the Meiji took control of Japan and made many reforms. This period was called the Meiji Restoration, and during this time, Japan made more reforms than Russia did. The reforms that took place were feudalism was abolished, political power was centralized, the samurai were sent abroad to learn about Western science and technologies, and lastly, the samurai were abolished as a class. When some samurai came back, they took what they had learned about modern politics and business practices from the West and put it to work. These samurais created a new element to the business class formed by industrialization. Mitsubishi was the most important company that was created during this time period. Mitsubishi was created by Iwasaki Yutaro. The Mitsubishi company was probably the most important because it's still around today. This achievement in technology brought a feeling to Japan that they could succeed. The government being centralized was also modernized and changed into an imperial government with limited parliamentary rule. A constitution was created very similar to that of the Germans, where the leader had complete power over the military and could name his ministers. The Japanese became extremely fond of this government and set it in place. The flaw in Japan's industrialization was that they had limited natural resources and were dependent on foreign coal and steel. It was no trouble, though, to them because of their new military strategies and imperialistic ideas. They used imperialism to gain what natural resources they need. While doing this, Japan rose to the final greatest imperial nation of the 19th century. With all of their victories that followed because of this, also became a great deal of nationalism to a powerful nation. As Western culture began to grow at an increasing rate, Japan and countries like it were being left in the dust. Japanese officials realized that they would never be taken seriously throughout the world until they became more Western. Following in the footsteps of Western nations like Britain, Germany, and Italy, Japan eventually became another example of countries showing industrialization, imperialism, and nationalism between the Napoleonic era and the First World War. Through these major changes, Japan became the most advanced country in Asia and remains in that position today.